All right, so today we're going to cover the topic of World War One. When we talk about moving into the 19th century, a lot of people moving into the 20th century, a lot of people see the 19th century as extending and beginning really at 1789 with the French Revolution and extending all the way up to World War One. And World War One ends up becoming this very pivotal moment where, in some sense, modernity ends. The skepticism, the cynicism of Nietzsche, the nihilism, the Freudian psychological analysis, all of these things are ushering in this new period in history that we begin to call post-modernity. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that human progress had been so very optimistic, and imperialism and the ugliness that came from the imperial efforts of the Western European countries, the ways in which they exploited other nations and other races for the sake of economic wealth and the accrual of influence and power, created this very cynic, a large amount of cynicism within the global mindset. Next time, we're going to look at the interwar period, and with that, we'll look at the Russian Revolution, which the Russian Revolution took Russia out of World War One. The experience of being involved in World War One so taxed the economy and taxed the infrastructure of Russia that it actually invoked a revolution from below that brought in the communistic ideology. And so we'll talk about that next time, along with Stalin's USSR and Hitler's rise. And that's how we're going to basically look at the interwar period from a European history standpoint. So as we're entering into World War One, we have these four world powers: Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. With Otto von Bismarck, Germany had become an incredibly powerful nation state that had created a lot of alliances. Particularly, there was a triple alliance between them, Germany, Austria, and Italy. And that triple alliance put Germany in the situation where if there was any imperial conflicts, those three nations were obligated and called to come to bat for each other from a militaristic standpoint. At the same time, the United Kingdom and the France had basically established somewhat of an alliance with one another because of like interests, and they saw Germany as a threat to their two nations. And even though Britain had naval superiority throughout the world, Germany was then at this point in the early 20th century starting to develop naval interests that were going to compete with Great Britain. Russia, for the most part, tried to stay neutral from all of these nations, but it set up neutral peace treaties with both Germany and, well, particularly with Germany, that kept it at first from getting completely involved in World War One. So let's look at how World War One begins. This is a timeline that's going to cover basically the entire conversation that we're going to have today. I just really want to focus in on June 28th, 1914, when Ferdinand gets assassinated. When Ferdinand gets assassinated, Austria goes to war against Serbia. And when Austria goes to war against Serbia, it calls up the alliance between Germany and Austria. And of course, Russia is allied with Serbia. And so all of those peace initiatives between Germany and Russia fall apart at that point. And Germany attacks Russia, which for Germany ended up being part of their imperialistic plan. There were lands that were appealing and attractive to Germany that were in Russian holdings, particularly the Polish area. So at the same time as Germany goes up against Russia, Germany takes this opportunity to attack France and create a war on two different fronts, the Western Front and the Eastern Front in Russia. All of this is territorially designed for Germany to expand its own influence. Pretty quickly, all of these alliances get called up, and there are two major powers that come into play that fight for and against one another. Among the Allied powers, France is there trying to protect Belgium because Germany is pushed into Belgium, and as it's pushing very quickly into Belgium, it's trying to reach to Paris as quickly as it possibly can as part of its Schlieffen Plan, which we'll talk about that in a moment. So France is protecting Belgium. The British are coming in to protect France and Belgium. Russia has its interests with Serbia, and Italy ends up throwing itself in with the Allied powers as well, along with Japan and the United States. The key powers in the Axis are Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so here's a map of the two major fronts that you have developing. You have the Western line, which basically runs across the western territory of Belgium, going all the way south to Switzerland, and that line pushes pretty close throughout 1914 to Paris. But with the efforts of Britain and France up to 1917, it's pushed back into the middle of Belgium, which we're going to talk about that very slow advance that takes place. And then, of course, there is the Eastern Front as well, pushing over towards Russia. We'll get to talk more about that next time when we talk about the interwar period, about the effects of World War I that led to the Russian Revolution. So we're primarily going to be looking at the Western Front today in our class. So what is the Schlieffen Plan? The German leadership had a general named Schlieffen who had created and constructed a plan of very quick advance that they thought was going to cause the entire Western Front to cave in and for France to be completely occupied and taken rather rapidly. And the way this was going to work is the German forces were going to sweep through Belgium, and they were going to sweep around close to the English Channel, and in that effort they were hoping that that was going to push back any attempts or desires, maybe intimidate Britain from getting involved. And as they swept around, they were going to outflank Paris and take France from the west. Unfortunately, that plan is completely foiled by a combined expeditionary force of British troops and the French resistance that are able to halt this advance basically at the edge of the Belgian border, protecting France in particular, French territory. Now, one of the reasons why the Schlieffen Plan failed was because of the Eastern Front. At this critical junction point in August of 1914, when the Schlieffen Plan is taken place, the Eastern Front is also being confronted by Russian forces, and the Germans had to redeploy over 100,000 troops from the Western Front to the Eastern Front in order to defeat advancing Russian forces. They're able to stop those Russian forces at the Battle of Tannenberg and turn back the Russians, but this ended up causing the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and the not having the brute force to take all of Paris. And so that is when trench warfare really began to set in. So let's go ahead and just talk about like three major elements of warfare in World War I that were really critical in World War I. The first one is the deploying of poison gas. Poison gas as a warfare innovation was first deployed at the Second Battle of Ypres on 2nd of April 1915. Poison gas was used as a tool to cause confusion and to cause fear and anxiety, and of course, to immediately disorient the enemies. Of course, it also had a mortal effect to those that did not have any sort of protective gear. Uh, this was one way in which they were able to cross and make gains in the trench warfare. It was one way in order to increase the war of attrition, which the war of attrition was rather critical, causing starvation, causing psychosis, causing fear, intimidation through the use of poison gas, were all techniques in which were used by various forces to create advances. Uh, at the Battle of the Somme, which took place in February, November 1916 and July of November of 1916, both for the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme, these are a couple years into the warfare. And so in 1914, on the Western Front, when things first began with the Schlieffen Plan and then the Second Battle of Ypres, at that time they are just developing these defenses that are called trenches. And these trenches were used to create small advances and to ward off attackers. The Germans developed very well constructed trenches that were paneled with wood. If you watch the film 1917, they create bunkers underneath that are well constructed and well protected. They created their trenches as if they were planning to be settled in for an extensive amount of time. Whereas the British and the French, because they were the ones who were under real defense, it was really important for them to create advances and to attack and to push back the Germans back into Germany. Because of that, they always created their trenches as a very temporary line, hoping and intending that they would be able to advance that line to the Germans as quickly as possible. What ended up happening is there was created a no man's land between the German offensive line and the British and French offensive line. This no man's land was an area in which if you were caught in it, you were probably going to die. It was an area that had experienced extensive shelling. It was an area that was rather open and easily you were indefensible to gunfire. And usually this was that long stretch of land between the two trenches that thousands and thousands of men would end up perishing because of these large, massive attacks that would take place. When we think about World War I, we think about the massive amount of life that's lost. Even in August in 1914, you have upwards of hundreds of thousands of men whose lives are being cast away. A junior officer would probably survive for only about 2 months during any given season of the war between 1914 to 1917. That was the life expectation. What this did was this created a very different understanding of war than had existed for the last century. War had been nobilized, it had been romanticized, it had been depicted as this very courageous and valorous effort.